Hello, welcome to the Infinite Dial 2026, America's longest running survey on digital media consumer behaviors. I'm Megan Lazovick, Vice President at Edison Research at SSRS. And we've invited back our star guest, the editor of Podnews and a recent inductee to the Podcast Hall of Fame, Mr. James Cridland.
Oh, well, thank you. The real star is the data, which we'll get onto. But yes, it's great to be back here for another year. I've worked in radio and audio for over 35 years as a radio consultant, as a radio futurologist, indeed, and as a journalist. And I've been quoting infinite dial numbers for nearly as long. So it's great to be part of it this year. Megan, I noticed that there's a new logo there for Edison Research and the letters SSRS.
That's right. This past October, Edison Research was acquired by SSRS, a like-minded full-service research firm with some incredible people and resources. We're super excited to have them be a part of the Infinite Dial this year. However, it would not be possible without our sponsor. We owe a great deal of gratitude to SiriusXM Media for funding this publicly available report. SiriusXM has been an incredibly supportive partner on many Edison research initiatives through the years. So thank you, SiriusXM, and all the smart people there, including Carrie DeGroot, Dave Newton, Melissa Paris, and many others, for your continued leadership in the audio space.
Now, the Infinite Dial is really unique data because it predates the smartphone, it predates podcasting, it predates Sirius, and predates XM, and it has great trending data that really shows how multi-platform audio has become.
From the early days of internet audio to today's podcast landscape and beyond, the Infinite Dial has become an essential benchmarking tool. You can find the study on the web dating all the way back to 1998. That's 28 years of free data.
Yeah, and it's really great that Edison Research does that and makes top-line data available to everybody. It is the gold standard, and the data is really useful to understand where we are. Now, of course, you can subscribe to get even more detailed information. And this webinar is just the US too. The Infinite Dial is also put together across other countries like New Zealand and Australia, where I am. And it's always nice to work out how far behind how far in front we are down here compared to you lot up there. And if you're watching from somewhere other than the US, please do me a favor and work out how you can bring the Infinite Dial to your country too. And I'm sure that Megan would love to help.
Yes, please. Since we started the Infinite Dial studies in 1998, it's been our priority to adhere to rigorous research standards. And just as media behaviors change over time, so have survey methodology practices. This January, we surveyed 2,050 individuals aged 12 and older. Approximately half were drawn from the SSRS opinion panel, recruited through probability sampling methods, including random digit dialing and address-based sampling. This updated approach allows us to maintain our gold standard research practices while reaching Americans through current channels. Our sample was weighted to represent the U.S. 12 plus population according to census data. Please download the report after this webinar for more details on the study methodology or reach out to us with any questions. If you are familiar with the Infinite Dial, then you'll recognize most of the topics we cover from previous years, with one exception. We've added AI usage to our survey of digital behaviors. This will be a fascinating category to watch, not only to see how consumers adopt the technology, but also as the technology changes or influences the world around it.
And of course, the numbers I'm most keen to find out are the podcast numbers as podcasting continues to grow and become even more mainstream, whether it's Mel Robbins or Smartless, or maybe a bit of Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. Podcasting has had another great year, so I'm fascinated to learn what that means for the numbers.
The Infinite Dial has chronicled the adoption of technology since its very first survey. And before we look at the latest device ownership numbers, let's take it all the way back to 1998 so we can see how far we've come. When the Infinite Dial was first released in 1998, only 50% of Americans aged 12 and older had a computer in their household. Now, I considered myself pretty lucky, actually, because my dad liked to build computers in his spare time. So I lived in one of those households.
Well, I was playing around with computers in 1981, so I think I win this game actually.
Does showing your age mean you're winning, James?
But in 1998, only 31% of Americans had internet access, probably through a free CD from AOL or CompuServe or something, and you had to wait for mum to finish her phone call before you could get online. Online audio was in its infancy, with only 6% of Americans having ever used it, according to the first ever infinite dial. I mean, real audio wasn't that hard to install, was it? And as for mobile phones, well, let's fast forward 10 years or so.
Infinite Dial shows that the smartphone was the next milestone in consumer media shifts. By 2009, 10% of the US population aged 12 and older owned a smartphone. That rose to 91% in 2023 and has pretty much hovered there ever since. That's an estimated 262 million Americans aged 12 and older who own a smartphone. This device is one of the biggest disruptors this survey has documented. It has completely changed America's media consumption habits. Now, when smart speakers like Amazon Alexa and Google Home debuted, we were very excited about this category, partly because we knew it was ripe with opportunity for audio content providers. In 2017, 7% of the US population aged 12 and older owned one of these devices. It rose to a third of the population by 2021, but its growth has not come close to that of smartphones. In 2026, we estimate 39% of the US 12 and older population owns such a device, an estimated 112 million people.
And it turns out more interesting than the device itself is the voice assistant technology inside it, which has now moved out of the speaker and moved into many other devices in our lives. And it's made even more intriguing by the integration of AI, and we'll be touching on AI later.
Yes, I'm very excited to share that with you folks. But there's one more device worth noting today, the smart TV. This continues to be an increasingly exciting space for audio as we watch it converge with video through Netflix deals, Apple Podcast announcements, and YouTube usage. Today, 81% own a smart TV, an estimated 233 million people. All three of these smart devices, phones, speakers, TVs, are relevant to our conversation about the evolution of America's media habits over time. Now to the topic that really was the true inspiration for Infinite Dial. Edison began as a radio research firm in 1994. Many of our clients delivered their content somewhere between 88 and 108 on the radio dial. But there were disruptors entering the space, allowing content to be delivered through the internet, removing all limitations of radio spectrum, thus the term Infinite Dial.
Yeah, it's such a clever name. I worked on the first streaming radio app in the world back in March 2005. Before then, internet radio meant that you were connected on your desktop computer, probably. And Spotify only launched in 2008, although we did have Napster and Livewire, LimeWire, and other slightly less legal things a little earlier. Online audio has really changed, and it's great that Infinite Dial has been able to monitor these changes.
Right. So much has changed in this space over time. Today, when we refer to online audio in this study, we mean listening to AM/FM radio streams, audio content available only online, such as podcasts or streaming music services. Let's start with the overall listening trends. Here's the percentage of people who say they listened to online audio in the past month. Starting at just 5% at the turn of the century, monthly online listening increased consistently over time. By 2023, 3/4 of the US population reported listening to online audio in the last month. And in 2026, 81% of the US population reported listening in the last month. That's an estimated 233 million monthly listeners.
But is it all young people who are using online audio?
Increasingly not anymore. When we look at the data by age group, we get some answers. For the past 3 years, listening has been essentially flat among the youngest age group, 12 to 34, and also among those aged 35 to 54. But the growth is really coming from those 55 and older. This really is quite the trend, growing by just under 20 points from 52% in 2024 to 70% today.
Yeah, and this is a number worth repeating, so I'm going to repeat it. Online audio's fastest growing audience is Americans over 55. That's up from 52% to 70% in just 2 years. So if you're a radio broadcaster watching this, I think this is your takeaway number. 55 plus has been radio's core audience for a while. They're the people who listen longest and most often. But every year, a new set of people move into the 55 plus age group, including me this year. In fact, me next week. Your core audience is more comfortable with technology than it's ever been before. You can see that as a threat, or you can see that as an opportunity. And I talk a lot about the future of radio. People already trust your station. The people on your station, radio is incredibly well trusted. But your opportunity is to provide a human connection and a shared experience across all of the platforms that your audience uses.
Well, first of all, happy birthday, James. Everybody drop a
Thanks.
happy birthday to James in the chat. But also, you're speaking for the people here. In qualitative research with audio listeners, human connection is a major theme of our conversations. Connection and shared experiences are important and memorable to these audiences. Anyway, moving on, here are the weekly numbers for online audio listening. 76% of the US population aged 12 and older are weekly online audio listeners, which means we've met a new milestone with 3/4 of the US population listening to online audio in the last week, which equals an estimated 219 million people.
Yeah, more than 3/4 per week. And that's really close to the monthly figure that we saw above. So basically, if you listen monthly, you listen weekly as well.
Yeah, such a great observation. And that's great for the brands in the space too. Now, if we break down monthly listening by brand, we see that Spotify is the leader at 36%. YouTube Music specifically asked in the survey as YouTube Music, the streaming music service from YouTube, is a close second at 34%, followed by Pandora at 21%, Amazon Music at 19%, and Apple Music at 17%. Then there's iHeartRadio and SoundCloud closing out the list at 12 and 6, respectively. We also asked our respondents which of these brands they use most often to listen to music. Here, among the 12 plus online audio user population, Spotify is the clear leader at 32%, followed by YouTube Music at 23%, and Apple Music and Pandora are tied at 12%. Spotify has an even greater lead among those aged 12 to 34. Just under 50% of that population prefer Spotify. And in this age category, Apple Music beats YouTube Music service by 2 points at 18%. Spotify wins those aged 35 to 54, but by a less of a margin, closely followed by YouTube Music. And Pandora comes in at third among this group at 16%.
And here is the 55 plus category. It's the one most poised for growth, remember, and the one with the most handsome people in it, so my wife tells me. And we have a different number one. YouTube Music is at number one with 28%, Pandora at 17%, and Spotify at 16%. And just for the record, I was using YouTube Music last year, but this year, because I'm young at heart and also because the Australian government has made it illegal, I've switched to Spotify. Anyway, really interesting differences in age group here.
Now, there's a category of online audio that has been slowly growing its audience. Audiobooks, while still technically available in offline format, are finding an audience online as well. In 2015, only 21% of the 12 plus population listened to an audiobook in the last year. And in 2026, that audience rose to 37%, which is an estimated 107 million people. And here's an exciting one that we have not yet had the pleasure of releasing. I honestly couldn't decide where this slide even belongs in the infinite dial. Earlier, you saw we specifically asked about the YouTube music service in the online audio section. We also separately measure podcast consumption via YouTube in an upcoming podcast section. And there's even an argument that YouTube should be included in the upcoming social media section.
Yes, or I mean, one of those people might be the Australian government who banned accounts on YouTube for children last year as part of the social media ban for kids. Just imagine how delighted my 13-year-old daughter is with that. Crikey.
Yeah, exact. I absolutely can imagine it, seeing as I have a 13-year-old daughter at home as well. So I get it. I get it. I'm glad I'm not living it, James.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, here's my point. YouTube is central to the American media landscape, and people use it in many ways for all types of content. Here we see that 91% of the US 12 plus population has ever used YouTube. Now, monthly usage is 84%, and 78% of Americans 12 and older said they used it in the last week. Now, Infinite Dial documents the shifts in media habits over time, and YouTube was certainly a disruptor when it arrived.
And of course, YouTube is still changing things in the world of podcasting, which I imagine is next, right, Megan?
Well, yes to the first thing you said, no to the second. We're almost to podcasting, but few more things first. Let's start with social media. The Infinite Dial started tracking social media adoption in 2008, and smartphones became increasingly central to Americans' lives. So did the platforms they used. And I don't mean to imply causation, both habits grew together. For those in media and marketing, it became clear that following audiences onto these platforms was increasingly important, which is why we have closely followed the changes in the space since the beginning. And what will be especially interesting in this section is not just which platforms are most relevant overall, but also which are the most relevant for each demographic. The generational platform divide is important to understand if you are using social media as a part of your audience reach strategy. In 2008, only 10% of respondents reported ever using social media. And in the 2020s, overall social media has mostly been stable. 85% of those 12 and older in the US currently use social media, estimated at 246 million people. And while Facebook had a much bigger lead in previous years, it is still firmly the brand with the largest number of users at 68% of the population. Instagram, another Meta brand, comes in second at 54%. 42% of the US population aged 12 and older use TikTok, and Reddit is just 4 points behind at 38%.
But there's no doubt that social media is more fragmented these days, which I personally think is a bit of a shame. Blue Sky is there with just 5%, with a brand new CEO announced just last week. Truth Social is at 6%, and Mastodon, which is the one that I'm on, is just 2%. Megan, we're told that Facebook is just for old people now. Is there any truth to that?
Well, what's your definition of old, James? Like owning a personal computer in 1981 old?
Hey, shade from the young person.
I'm joking. It's super cool. You're super cool, James.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we asked, which social media brand do you use most often? And among the total population, 40% said Facebook. Instagram and TikTok are tied at 16%. But your question was, is Facebook just for old people? So let's view the same question by age group. The second bar we've added to the screen are the preferred social media platforms by those aged 12 to 34. 16% of them use Facebook, and another 22% use Instagram. But look at that larger black bar in the middle. TikTok is preferred by 29% of those in the 12 to 34 age group. While TikTok usage has been the story among this group for years, this is the first year the Infinite Dial has recorded the platform as the service most used by this age group. TikTok is the #1 platform for Americans 12 to 34, and this is an excellent way to reach them. Let's move on to those 35 to 54. Facebook is used most often by 45% of these social media users, with an Instagram a distant second at 16%. And finally, those 55 and older are predominantly using Facebook, with much smaller portions of other brands most often.
There we go. Although 5% of us still using TikTok, though.
True, true. Do you do any TikTok dances, James? Anyway, a great way to look at these social media brands is through their user composition, meaning which demographics use each platform. Facebook skews female, with 44% men and 56% women, and skews older, with 50% of those who use the service mostly in the 55 and older age group. Now, TikTok skews young and female. X, formerly known as Twitter, skews male and those age 35 to 54. And an incredible majority of users who prefer Snapchat are aged 12 to 34.
I'm not even sure what Snapchat is, but we think, don't we, that social media connects us to each other. But really what all of this data is showing us is that they're connecting us to a specific group of people, probably more people like us. So even before you add the algorithm, just the type of users on these platforms is really a bit of a bubble. And this is fascinating data.
Yes, totally. And in my standard "why should you do research" lecture, I always use that term. You've got to break out of your bubble. Okay, on to the next section. Infinite Dial has also tracked technology adoption in the car. And this is a very interesting environment because disruption is somewhat delayed here. According to S&P Global Mobility reports, the average vehicle on the road in 2026 is 12 years old. Let's look at the data to see what's driving audio on the road. We'll start by going back 10 years. In 2016, 84% of drivers reported using AM/FM to listen to audio in their vehicles. The #2 source 10 years ago, believe it or not, was CDs, with 56% saying they used it in the last month. MP3s accounted for 28%, followed by online audio and SiriusXM.
And I do notice that 10 years ago, podcasts were seemingly so unusual in the car that you didn't even ask whether somebody was listening to them.
Yeah, if only you were involved, James, 10 years ago. Real error. Anyway, moving on to today, which again, 100% doesn't feel current because technology in the vehicle on the road is on average over a decade old. In 2026, 73% of respondents reported using AM/FM in their vehicles in the last month. Radio is by far the most used by people on the road. CD and MP3 usage has gone down significantly. Online audio has more than doubled from 21% in 2016 to 48% today. SiriusXM has held its ground in the car as it's continued to offer service in new vehicles from many manufacturers. Now, podcasts, we don't know the starting point, but the end point has surpassed many of the other sources on the slide. 37% of those with vehicles have listened to podcasts in the car in the past month, surpassed only by online audio and our #1 in-car option, AM/FM radio.
Yeah, so AM/FM radio is still #1 in the car, and that's really important. It's the best place for local information. It's free. It's a great place to catch people on the way to the store to tell them what to buy. Radios in cars go together like fish and chips, or if I should translate, like peanut butter and jelly. And car manufacturers would be mad to remove it. But things are changing. Now, nearly half of Americans stream online audio while driving, and more than a third are using podcasts. How does that split by age, Megan?
Yes, let's look again at the current data for the top three audio platforms in the car by the monthly reach in 2026. And this time we'll break it down by age. Here's AM/FM radio. While radio is used most in the car by those age 55 and older, indicated in green at 81%, radio is strong in the car among all age demographics, with those 18 to 34 at 65% and those 35 to 54 at 68%. Onto online audio. The reach here is much more disparate by age group. The younger group is the strongest set of in-car listeners at 73%. Just over half of the middle age group, indicated in blue, currently listen to online audio in the car, and a much smaller group of those 55 and older listen to online audio while driving. Finally, podcasts, with patterns similar to that of online audio, were stronger among those 18 to 34 at 55% and weakest among the oldest group at 18%.
So AM/FM radio is resilient in the car. That's not going away anytime soon, but the digital migration is accelerating, if you'll pardon the pun. Younger demos are already listening to a majority of digital audio in the car.
So we've seen platform usage in the car, but Infinite Dial has also been tracking dashboard technologies that may be influencing platform choices in the car. Here we see those who either have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, and those who use either system in the car. 41% of drivers have either CarPlay or Android in their vehicle. That's virtually no change from what we reported in 2025. And 34% of drivers use either of those systems. Again, similar numbers to last year.
I'm reading loads of news stories saying that big auto manufacturers are talking about removing CarPlay or Android Auto from their cars. But I think, as we can see here, a third of Americans use these things. I mean, I have a new Chinese electric car. I can kind of deal with it not having an AM radio inside it. But if it didn't have CarPlay, I don't think I'd have bought it, to be honest.
Nice. No average 12-year-old car for you. But you're not average, nor are you American.
No, you noticed that.
However, you are somebody who uses their CarPlay. And we also know that if someone has this dashboard technology, they are more likely to use it. 83% of those who have either system actively use it.
Now, Megan, we've seen some encouraging podcast numbers so far. More than a third listen in the car, more than half of under 35s. Spotify, the number one online audio brand, and they have podcasts too. So is it time for the podcast numbers now?
Why, yes, it is.
Excellent. Go on then.
This next category is likely the reason many of you are here today. It has been incredible to see the podcast medium evolve over the years, especially through the lens of the Infinite Dial. Every category we reviewed so far contributes to the podcast consumption growth. There's the rise of mobile device owners, the shifting consumer behaviors towards on-demand media led by online audio adoption, and even the somewhat stunted adoption of that behavior in cars. We also identified another factor that affects the measurement of this medium, video. The growth of smart TV ownership in the home and the rise of YouTube consumption have a tremendous impact on the way Americans consume media. Whether or not you are an audio-only purist, you have to acknowledge that video podcasts have increased the awareness and reach of the podcast medium. So you've waited long enough. Here are the podcast figures. Is this the year we finally stop publishing podcast awareness? It feels like they're aware, right, James?
It looks like that, doesn't it?
We asked if you had ever heard of the term podcasts, and 86% of respondents in 2026 said yes. That's an estimated 248 million people in the US aged 12 and older.
So people know what a podcast is. At least they think they know what a podcast is.
Yes, and let's pause to address the elephant in the room. And by elephant, I mean YouTube. And we'll do so using two other Edison studies, Edison Share of Ear and Edison Podcast Metrics. Edison Share of Ear is a diary study where respondents record all their audio listening for 24 hours. So when you see share of ear, think time. Share equals time. How much time did people spend with each audio source on their diary day? Now, in this chart, we're looking at the time spent consuming podcasts on a diary day and which service was used to access that podcast content. And remember, this is a study of time, not the number of people. So out of all of the time reported with podcasts, 32% of that time was spent with YouTube. A quarter of that podcast time was through Spotify, and another 20% through Apple. These are the big players in the space.
Yeah, this is a fascinating graph. Can I just clarify? Share of ear is measuring people watching podcasts as well as listening to them, is it?
Yes, absolutely. The Edison team is so careful to understand all the nuances of audio and consumers. And when they observe a behavior, they account for it. And while the share of your design always had the ability to capture YouTube, about 6 years ago, we added additional measures to make sure it was capturing it more thoroughly. And I also want to touch for just a minute on our other study, Edison Podcast Metrics. This is an ongoing study of weekly podcast consumers. So for this chart on the right, we're thinking about people or the percentage of people that are reached. And the Edison Podcast Metrics data also documented a shift to podcast consumption via YouTube. In 2026, 39% of weekly podcast consumers used YouTube as their primary podcast service, followed by Spotify at 20% and Apple Podcasts at 11%.
Now, these are fascinating numbers. We also know that people who use Apple Podcasts use it more often than YouTube for podcasts, and I'm sure that that's an Edison Research weekly email waiting to be sent out. A lot of the other data in the market is based on downloads and streams, and we shouldn't forget that Apple Podcasts has automatic downloads, so downloads don't always equate to usage. So the infinite dial numbers here are really helpful to understand the relationship between the different platforms.
Right. So with YouTube in mind, I'll note in 2024 and everything before, the wording for this question in Infinite Dial included, have you ever listened to a podcast? But in 2025 and beyond, we asked, have you ever listened to or watched a podcast? And in 2026, 80% of those 12 and older in the US have ever listened to or watched a podcast. That brings our new estimate to 230 million podcast consumers in the US. And that reach of 80% is only a few points behind familiarity at 86%, which means people know about podcasts, and most who know have tried a podcast. Let's see who liked podcasts enough to listen regularly. We have exciting numbers for monthly podcast consumption as well. 58% of those 12 and older have listened to or watched a podcast in the last month. That's an estimated 167 million people.
And that's another all-time high and a headline for me tomorrow in the Podnews newsletter, which is brilliant. 58% of all Americans are monthly podcast consumers, another significant increase from last year. Now, podcasts have always been male skewed. How are we doing on consumption by gender? And do I really want to know the answer?
Here's the 4-year trend of monthly listeners by gender. And you're right, James. Men have consistently listened to podcasts in larger numbers than women. In 2026, there is a 9-point gap with 62% of men listening in the last month and 54% of women. But either way, we can say that the majority of both groups are monthly podcast consumers. And here's the 4-year trend by age. The two younger age groups are consistently higher than those 55 and older in terms of monthly podcast consumption. This is a powerful ad story, given you can reach more than 2/3 of younger audiences through podcasts.
And there's also significant growth in those aged 55 plus, just like we saw earlier on as well. And there's more content now for people aged 55 plus. And as those more familiar with technology age into that demo, then they're more comfortable with it as well. So while those aged 55 plus aren't as trendy as younger audiences, let me tell you, many of them have lots of disposable income as well, and they are ideal to advertise to.
And finally, the weekly estimates. We are inching ever closer to the majority. Currently, 45% of the population reported listening or watching a podcast in the last week. 130 million weekly podcast consumers.
That's a really healthy increase from last year, actually. It's really good to see. And this weekly figure is increasing faster than the monthly figure, which I hope means that people are consuming more podcasts more often than they ever have, either listening to podcasts, obviously, or watching them. Megan, how many people watched and how many people listened? Should I be doing video now for the podcast that I do?
Well, let's get into that. Here we see all the categories a person can fit into for the survey. They could have said they listen to podcasts but don't watch them. That was 21% of the sample. They could have said they do both. They have listened or they have ever watched. And that was the majority at 57%. A small slice of the population specified that they watch podcasts but do not listen to audio-only podcasts. And finally, the remaining 20% have neither watched nor listened.
So while you were all worried about listening versus watching, video versus audio, the important takeaway here is podcasting is a dual format medium, with 57% of Americans having both listened to and watched a podcast.
Yeah, so video isn't replacing podcast audio. It's expanding the tent. If tents can expand, they can now anyway. Video is making podcasts bigger, and there's evidence here that audiences are overwhelmingly consuming both video and audio podcasts. And now Apple Podcasts is all set to launch an enhanced video service in the coming weeks, so things will change even further.
That's right. And Edison Research will continue to measure both audio and video podcast consumption, and we plan to share that data with you. Here's that same breakdown by monthly consumers. 15% listened but didn't watch in the last month. 36% listened and watched. 7% only watched. And 42% did not consume a podcast in the last month. Finally, weekly consumption. Listened only in the last week is 13%. Listened and watched, 26%. Watched only was 6%. And then the remaining 55% did not consume a podcast in the past week.
So the amount of watched only is low. So people maybe are finding podcasts on YouTube, but consuming them in audio form through their podcast player as well to fit in with their lives. Something for their ears when their eyes are busy, I suppose. Anyway, really interesting.
Right, that could be, but I won't base it on my personal observations or my bubble, as I like to say. This is definitely a topic we plan to explore more in 2026 with research.
Now that's all of the podcasting numbers done. That's all that I care about. So is that us done?
No, you have to stick around just a little bit longer. I have one more thing. Now, we've been moving through this presentation somewhat chronologically by moments of disruption. We thought our options were infinite once audio became untethered. And now, why does it feel like we're about to be shot up into outer space with so many unknowns, philosophical questions, excitement, and fear around this next topic? And what do we do in this situation? Well, at Edison Research, we research. We document, we observe. Like every technological advancement we've reviewed today, AI has implications in our everyday lives and work. I imagine many of you are actively grappling with AI's impact on your businesses. Content creation, ad buying, and discovery are all being disrupted. For the first time from the Infinite Dial, here's how many American consumers have recognized and adopted AI. So let's start with awareness. We asked respondents if they had heard of a list of generative AI brands. And the results are striking. When we roll up the answers for all of the brands, this is what we get for overall AI awareness. 93% of Americans are familiar with at least one generative AI brand. That's a level of awareness that podcasting hasn't achieved after 20 years of measurement.
Yeah, that's a real wow moment, isn't it? And AI has got there, in 3 years? I think that really tells you something about the cultural moment that we're in now.
Definitely. Now, let's look at who's actually using these tools. We asked a long list of AI tools, and when, again, we roll up the usage among all of them, we see that 57% of Americans have ever used generative AI assistants. That's more than half of the country.
Yeah, and I think particularly in terms of podcasting, lots of people using AI for all kinds of things, whether it's transcripts, whether it's automated chapters that Apple Podcasts does, whether it's show notes and all of that kind of stuff. I don't write any of my show notes. Those are all done by AI as well. So it really is in every part of everything that we work on.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting for everyone in the room, because this is the question we were all quietly wondering about. Who is using AI?
And the answer for media creators, Megan, seems to be your audience is using AI.
When we look at the weekly media behaviors among AI users and AI non-users, we see a consistent and significant gap across the board. AI users are more likely to have listened to online audio in the last week than AI non-users, 87% versus 61%. And there is a difference between these two groups when we look at weekly podcast consumption. More than half of AI users are weekly podcast consumers, while only a third of AI non-users are weekly podcast consumers. And in other areas of weekly digital engagement, like social media or YouTube, where usage is higher among the general population, we also see a significant gap between those who use AI and those who don't.
So if you're a podcast publisher, an audio brand, a media company, the people already using your content are the same people who are earliest to adopt AI. That's not a coincidence. These are engaged, curious, digitally fluent consumers. And that might mean that they're more receptive to change than you think, and might mean that they're more accepting of AI in your show, maybe.
Maybe. Now, with new models launching regularly and AI companies marketing to mainstream audiences, the profile of the AI user is rapidly evolving. That's why Edison Research at SSRS has launched AI User Metrics, a new ongoing product built to deliver real-time insights into these shifts as they unfold. The study fields twice a month using the SSRS opinion panel. And according to the research, as of February 2026, 52% of Americans aged 18 and older use at least one AI chatbot on a weekly basis. We're also seeing significant differences between personal and professional use, another thread we will be pulling on in future waves. And a really cool example of why regular research in this category is necessary is this. Between wave 1 of AI user metrics in early February and wave 3, which just finished earlier this week, we can report a 58% increase in awareness for Claude AI from Anthropic. Their Super Bowl ads likely helped, but the brand's very public standoff with the Pentagon and now an active lawsuit against the administration thrust the brand into the spotlight. AI user metrics continues to track the story and others as they evolve.
So with Edison Research at SSRS, AI user metrics is following the shifts in real time, and the Infinite Dial provides the yearly benchmark for people like me to write about.
Exactly. The goal is that Infinite Dial will always be around to capture new media behaviors as they emerge, just like it has done since 1998. Let's wrap it up, shall we?
So online audio has never been bigger, and older Americans drive the latest increases. 81% of monthly listening, that's an all-time high. But the more interesting story is who is responsible for the recent growth. Americans 55 and older jumped from 52% to 70% in just 2 years. The audience that traditional radio has long depended on is now going digital fast, and that's both a challenge and a real opportunity for broadcasters who are willing to meet them there.
85% of Americans use social media, but they are not using the same social platforms. The platforms look wildly different depending on who you're talking to. TikTok is the number one platform for those 12 to 34, the first time we've recorded that in Infinite Dial. Facebook commands 55 and older, X skews heavily male, Snapchat's audience is overwhelmingly under 35, and fewer overlapping audiences on these platforms. Which platforms you're on determines which Americans you're actually talking to.
Podcast audiences are at record highs, and weekly consumption is catching up with monthly. 80% of Americans have ever listened to or watched a podcast. That's 230 million people. And 58% monthly is an all-time high at an estimated 167 million people. But the number I would really flag is 68%. That's the monthly podcast consumption among 35 to 54-year-olds. That's a premium advertising demographic. I remember it well. And podcasting now reaches more than 2/3 of them. Weekly, we're at 45%, 130 million Americans. At this point, the question isn't whether people listen to podcasts, it's how often.
Video and audio podcasts aren't competing. They are expanding the audience together. We spent a lot of time in this presentation saying listened to or watched, and now you know why. Among those who have ever consumed a podcast, 57% have done both. Video isn't replacing podcast audio. It's expanding the tent, bringing in new audiences and new behaviors. Whatever your feelings are on video podcasts, the data is clear. This is a dual format medium now.
YouTube defines category and can't be ignored. 91% of Americans have ever used YouTube. 78% used it last week. It's the number one podcast platform by primary service, by people. It shows up in online audio, podcasting, and depending on your definition, social media. And at some point, a distribution strategy that doesn't account for YouTube isn't really a full strategy.
Finally, AI adoption is moving faster than anything we've measured in Infinite Dial. 93% of Americans are aware of at least one generative AI brand, just about 3 years after being introduced. 57% of Americans are already using AI assistants. It took 16 years to get to a place where 57% of Americans have ever tried a podcast. Think about how quickly this adoption is happening. For everyone thinking about content creation, discovery, and ad buying, the disruption isn't coming. It's here, and we'll be watching closely. And you don't have to wait until the next Infinite Dial for updates on consumer media habits. Every week, Edison Research at SSRS publishes new findings from our research in our weekly email newsletter. Visit edisonresearch.com to subscribe. And of course, I don't start my day without reading your coverage, James. I'm pretty sure I thank you often for the work you do reporting on the audio industry, but I wanted to do so publicly here as well. Everyone, if you don't already do so, subscribe to the Podnews newsletter.
Oh, well, thank you. It's free, podnews.net. And I'd also like to thank the Infinite Dial team at Edison Research at SSRS. This is the gold standard, and this is data that now goes back decades. It's super useful. It's the most helpful data of record that we have. And it's been great to be part of it once more. And congratulations to you, Megan, as well as the rest of the Edison Research team for another fascinating year.
And thanks again to SiriusXM Media for sponsoring this research. It is amazing that you not only fund this research, but that you also help us share it with the industry. Look for the great work from the SXM Media team. They often publish really useful reports. And finally, thanks to everyone who logged in today or watched the replay. Shout out to any students watching. I got to speak with a number of you at a few different universities this year, and you really do make me so hopeful for the future of the industry. The full Infinite Dial webinar is available on Edison Research and the SSRS websites. Please share it with your friends and colleagues, and please reach out to us if you have any questions at info@edisonresearch.com. James, always a pleasure. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Megan, and keep listening.